Thank you all for being here. Can I start with a quick show of hands? Who in this room thinks of themselves as a theorist? Oh, quite a few. Who doesn't? Who thinks whatever they do, it's not theory? Okay, so that's sort of what I expected. And in the next couple of minutes, I'm trying to convince the non-theorists here that we need theory, and the theorists that yes, we need it, but maybe we should also rethink a little bit how we do it. I flew to this conference, as probably many of you, and I came from Düsseldorf Airport, and I was half expecting that it would be blocked by climate activists because they had glued themselves to other German airports the weeks before, and Düsseldorf was sort of next in line. They didn't, that's why I can be here. But there is, of course, a big moral question. Can we theorize when the world is on fire in so many ways? We sit at our laptops, we are in our seminar rooms or here at a conference, very peaceful, privileged. And at the same time, those are the planetary boundaries overshooting. We are all contributing our bit to it. And to what extent can theory contribute or should even try to contribute? Maybe it shouldn't. Is it responsible to still be a theorist, or should we glue ourselves to airports together with the other activists? And by the way, I'm here focusing on the climate and biodiversity crisis, but there are many other crises out there as well. And people might have similar questions about why do theory with regard to other acute crises out there as well. I'm still here. I'm still a theorist. Tell me if I'm just rationalizing what I'm doing, but I'll present you with a couple of arguments for why I think theory is still needed and can still make a contribution. And I think we do need the reflection on why we do this, and we need the conversation about it. That's something we owe to ourselves, also to our students. And many of us work at public universities, so you probably have these moments where you wake up and think, oh, I'm being paid by taxpayers' money. What are they getting for it? I have this sometimes. So I'm going to share a few reflections, and it's really an invitation to share thoughts about what we can and should contribute as theorists and how we could probably broaden the scope of what we're doing a bit. I'll start with a brief overview of some of the traditional tools of political theory and what they can contribute. And I will argue that in the face of the various crises that we are seeing, we should rethink certain assumptions about how we apply these tools. And I'm going to talk about three boundaries that we should rethink. The boundary to other fields, the boundary between Western and other traditions. And I guess the first problem is that we always talk about Western and other in that way, as I just did. And the boundary between the academic world and broader public discourse society, if you like. And to make this not only a matter of meta theory, I want to exemplify this a little bit with some ideas about value and value creation that I've been working on together with a colleague from Brazil recently. And I'll end with what is sort of my bigger project here, which I think, but again, tell me if I'm just rationalizing this, has deep connections with the climate crisis, namely to democratize the economy. And I'll ask what political theory can contribute to that. So just very briefly, what does political theory do? So we have history of ideas as a kind of repertoire of ideas and arguments, but also to explain where we are coming from, why things are what they are. And by the way, theory is in books, but theory is also out there embedded in institutions and cultural assumptions. And there is no theory-free reality out there that we're exploring. It's all been shaped by previous theorists. And that's why knowing the history of that is important. There's conceptual analysis. What kind of concepts do we use? How do we draw the boundaries between them? Why? Who has the right to draw them? What are the power relations there? Lots of critical theory can be understood as doing conceptual analysis, although it's also broader, of course. And then there's normative analysis in the sense of asking what should be the case, applying value concepts to concrete issues. So we just had a paper, just to give one example, by Sune on thinking through the Danish caricature discussions and the Quran burnings and how this relates to free speech. That's a very concrete political process that's happening. What can political theory contribute to that? And for that, a lot of discussion in recent years has been about the level of abstraction and the methodology. Do we idealize? Do we go very concrete? How exactly do we do this? My own take on these things is to say, we really need the different levels. We need the very abstract, but we also need the applied. And often we understand the abstract better once we apply them to concrete cases. And so they are mutually reinforcing. If people read each other's work, that's a small precondition for that to work. But I think of abstract and applied theorizing as very much in need of each other and informing each other. So all these things can, of course, be applied to the climate crisis. For example, when you think about history of ideas, there has been a lot of noise recently and a lot of buzz, some would say, about how we can rethink Karl Marx as an environmental thinker. And some people criticize this, saying, well, that's just reading something into Marx that isn't really there. But, that's exactly the arguments to be had. To what extent did he anticipate environmental constraints? How did he conceptualize nature and resources? And what does this say about our own relation to nature? How can we rethink it? Conceptual analysis, a very obvious example is justice about different generations. So not just justice applied to cohorts living at the same time, but projected into the future. And then asking, well, what does it even mean to say that a certain future generation will be better off or worse off, and what should we do about it? Lots of methodological questions about that as well, because what do we even know about how future generations will live? Or normative analysis, very concretely, what should be done? What should rich and poor countries contribute to climate mitigation? That's the kind of questions where you can get very close to policy analysis, policy advice. There is a question about the sort of the transmission belt of ideas from academia to policymakers. Does it work? Should it work? Is it maybe undemocratic if it works too well? Who knows? But at least many of the people who write in that space would think of their own contributions as addressing the public or the demos, so that their ideas can become part of public discourse and can ultimately contribute to policymaking in some way or another. Now, that's all really important work, but I want to think a little bit further about certain blind spots or reasons for doubt that I often have about our discipline. So one thing that you see a lot, or you see it once you've started looking at it in a way, and then you can't unsee it, is that a lot of theorizing assumes implicitly that we have a priority of the mind over the body, in the sense that people are motivated by arguments. If we understand the reasons, the emotions aren't so important because the emotions come from the body. Somehow it's a very rationalistic paradigm. And of course, one could say a lot about where this all comes from. I will not go into that in detail here. But what you very often then end up with is a view where, I mean, no one would say this out. It sounds ridiculous if I say it aloud, but in a way, it is the background picture if you really think it through. Namely, minds are somehow out there. The own bodies are somehow subjected to the minds, and the rest of nature is also just out there. And it's a resource for the minds to do the planning, to be autonomous, whatever. And of course, I don't need to go into all that is wrong with that picture. And you get funny reactions when you start putting this out there, and some people start saying, yeah, but it all becomes super vague, go continental if you talk about the body. But there is, of course, a lot of research done by people on bodies. I mean, the whole field of medicine, public health, all these things. And I often think that why on earth are political theorists not connecting more to those fields? Because they would actually deliver lots of arguments for what we call social justice, and they call a public health issue. So that is hard science by any means. So in that sense, all the doubts about this being vague and phenomenological, whatever, I like phenomenology, by the way, but that's all nonsense if you think about it as also the very hard data and so on that we can get from certain lines of public health research. A second issue, as I already mentioned, there is this question about, well, what kind of problems are we talking about? We have global problems, and we look at them from our own traditions. And I think often that's important to do in the sense of self-criticism. We need to know where our own misguided ideas are coming from and how they could fuck up the world in the way they did. So I think there's an important space for knowing the Western canon, but to really think about the global problems we have, and the climate crisis is the most obvious example, we also need to do more, and we need to do more to try to get in touch with other traditions and try to also, as a discipline, become more open, more diverse. And then that, if you start trying to do this, it becomes very practical. Who gets visas to conferences? Who has travel money? All these kinds of questions come up then. Another blind spot that I'm grappling with a lot is that there's this assumption in the background of a lot of theorizing that you somehow split society into different realms. So there is the political, and then there's the social for some people, and then there's maybe the family or the economy. And there's a real question here about, does it make sense to use these categories when you think about concrete problems? And of course, the academic disciplines also very often follow these lines. Political scientists explore the political realm. Economists explore the economy, and so on. And so there are also lots of questions about how this carving out of different fields actually happens. But as theorists, if, say, you want to do a normative analysis of a certain topic, what very often happens to me is that I realize, oh, there's research in different fields going on that I might need to draw on, but these fields don't really interact with each other. And then I'm sitting there with a pile of books and I'm trying to understand what even the research landscape is, because the social sciences are fragmented in a way that makes it difficult for the theorists to understand the state of the empirical art. So I think that's something we need to rethink in many cases as well. And I want to use one pair of categories that I'm sure is well known here for pointing to that question of what do we actually mean. So you've probably heard about the discussion whether we should talk about the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene or whatever scene, Nanocene, some people say. So trying to sort of pinpoint who's really responsible for the climate crisis by not just saying Anthropocene as if all of humanity had the same amount of blame, or whether we should try to be more specific. And I think that is really a question worth asking, but it's also then a question worth asking, well, what do we even mean by what something like capitalism? That's also another black box that we need to unpack in many cases. And so how can we understand which categories we take for granted for a certain project and which ones to open up? And that's something that I see a lot when I advise master or PhD students. They struggle with the fact that they want to open up all the black boxes and they want to get sort of all the wheels into motion. And of course, for every meaningful project, you need to hold certain things constant. So it's a very important theoretical decision to make at the beginning of a project. What are you going to hold constant, and just accept certain categories that are out there, and which categories are you going to challenge? I think that's often really one of the key questions to ask about a project you're starting when you try to theorize about real life phenomena. And I think if we want to do this, there are three boundaries which our discipline has for probably historical contingent reasons that we should rethink, renegotiate. I'm not saying everyone has to do everything differently, but I think as a field, we need to become more flexible and think more about these things. So the first one is between political theory and other disciplines. I mean, we could talk endlessly here about political theory versus philosophy. And in a way, who cares as long as the arguments are good? I think that's a question where we should really be totally pragmatic and just do good normative or conceptual or historical work. And then whatever label you want to plug on it, never mind. But there is a question about how to relate to other disciplines. And the example I'm going to give will illustrate one possibility, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, because interdisciplinarity is this big buzzword and you need to put it into any ground application, but to do it in practice can be really hard. And one way that I find facilitates doing it is actually to collaborate with real people in these other fields. But the whole tradition of our discipline celebrates the lonely genius who writes big books on their own, and that in a way inhibits the incentives or the sort of the mental space for doing teamwork with people in other disciplines. So I'll not say more here now, but I think we can say more, and maybe people can share their experiences later in the Q&A. Positive, as I said, how collaborate. The example I'm going to give later is how to effectively criticize, because I think that's also a task of political theory, and I'll exemplify it later on. Then, as I said, between the Western and other traditions, and very often you get this model of, oh, I have one class out of 10 on a non-Western thinker. It's sort of we also have one token non-Western author here. And I think that's better than nothing. So if you haven't done this yet, please do it in your courses, but that's not really how we should do it, especially as theorists in our research. And so there's a real question about how we can engage in a genuine dialogue with other traditions, and doing so without falling into forms of relativism or implicit hierarchization that are really ultimately not helpful. One model that I find quite interesting here is by Charbel Al-Hani and Alex Ludwig on what they call a partial overlap model, and where they think about the dialogue between different knowledge systems. So their case studies are stuff like fishermen in Brazil and Western scientists doing research on the fish and insect population in rivers. How do you create a common ground and integrate the epistemic contributions of these different groups? And I think that's the kind of question that we also need to ask for different traditions of theorizing. And yeah, exotic add-on versus the genuine dialogue, that's what I said. And then lastly, and I'll be brief here because I think Jonathan has more to say about this later on, about the boundary between academic and broader discourse. In science communication studies, there is such a thing as science communication studies. People talk a lot about the so-called deficit model. And the deficit model is that you assume the public has a knowledge deficit and you are the scientist who needs to fill the deficit. And everyone hates the deficit model because it simply doesn't work. First of all, lots of people out there do also know things that are relevant. And also, if you approach them with this attitude of, I'm the one who knows, you're the one who has the deficit, think about the psychology of that. It just doesn't work. But of course, the question is then, what are better ways of really collaborating with people who have different kinds of experiences without devaluing what expertise we as academics can contribute? So getting that balance right and implementing it is always far more difficult in practice than it sounds in theory. And ideally, you'd really want the dialogue to begin very early at the very questions you're asking. What questions are we addressing? Sometimes you then get sort of the opposite of the deficit model in the sense that you think, oh, I have something to say to the world out there, but somehow the world is not waiting for my message. Well, maybe sometimes you should also try to first find out what kind of practical political questions are there and can we contribute to solving those. I'm not saying that's the only thing we should do, but at least there is something to be said for dialogue with the broader public already at the level of the projects and questions we're addressing. Okay, so this was the theoretical picture. Now I want to give you a bit of an example, but this is all still work in progress. And first I want to thank my colleague Flavia Maximo from Brazil, from whom I learned a lot on these things. And we are writing a paper together on value and value creation. And you might think, what's the political theory element here? Well, assumptions about what is value enter into so many things that political theorists and also political, thank you, scientists do. Think about GDP and all kinds of rankings of countries. There's always an assumption in this about what is actually economic value and what does it say about a country, how high its GDP is, and so on. And Flavia comes from a region in Brazil where a lot of damage has been done because of mining. And that mining happens to get all the rare minerals for the electrification of cars and other things in the West. So it comes along as environmentally progressive. But of course, the local damage is huge. And the local population is often simply not heard in any of the discussions about what's supposed to happen. So when you ask, well, what kind of value creation is going on there? And what is it anyway? The traditional understanding is typically financial, it's economistic, only what can have a price is assumed to have a value, against Kant, sorry, Kantians here. And it's also undemocratic in the sense that it follows a logic of $1, one vote, not one person, one vote. It's always who has the resources determines what's the value here. And there are lots of critiques. I'll not go into details. There's, of course, a big feminist critique in feminist economics and feminist theory about how lots of things that don't have a price also have indisputable value for society. Silvio de Federici and others have written about this. There is also an environmental critique. And here's something very interesting is happening, namely the value of nature gets translated into monetary terms. And you then get calculations of the natural capital of, say, the Brazilian rainforest. And you get calculations of environmental services that the environment is contributing, as if you could just put it into one row with other factors of production, as if it wasn't just a precondition for anything else that happens. No, you just put a price tag on it and treat it as one of the inputs. But that's, of course, done because the people doing it are so desperate to somehow point out how important these things are that they see no other value, no other way of doing it than to translate it into the language of value that our political systems understand, which is monetary. Let me just speed up a bit. What Flavia and I are trying to add to these critiques is a geopolitical critique. Namely, where in the world does the value creation take place and who counts in determining it? And in this case of these Brazilian mining operations, there is a very interesting concept that local people together with scholars developed, namely the concept of invisible mud. Invisible mud is the idea that there are lots of dams there that have broken, but there are even more that haven't broken yet. But the people who live there, who might run into one of these environmental disasters, they always live with the anxiety and the fear that they might be the next victims. And that has lots of effects, measurable effects, if you want to measure them, on the psychological health, the mental health of children, what kind of education can they get? Do they think about the future? And it's a risk that's being imposed on them that may never materialize, but that really has an impact on the communities there. But of course, that doesn't show up in the GDP of those regions or of Brazil. And in the global vision of what it means to create economic value, these kind of things just don't count. And so you get to the question of, okay, who has the right to define what we value? And from there, I'll give you a very quick taste, because I don't think I have more time than that, about how this and many other arguments might lead to the project of democratizing the economy. So when you think about the political theory of the last decades, very often you have an assumption there that you have the primacy of politics, not for Marxists and anarchists, but for lots of others. The assumption is that you have the political realm and politics setting the framework. And within this framework, there's an economic sphere governed by a logic of efficiency, nature as resource. Lots of problems with this. How does political power relate to economic power? And Also, this is now a case of very abstract theorizing being directly applicable to a practical problem. If you think about the nature of efficiency as a value, it's not a first order value. It's a second order value once you've defined the aims you want to achieve. There's a famous paper by Julian Legrand on this. And also, can we really think of nature as secondary in this way? Or do we have to start with nature? And the interesting thing is that these things, I mean, I've been guilty of many of these assumptions for a long time, and I'm sure I'm still guilty of lots of other assumptions. Often people from the periphery see these blind spots and these distortions much better because they see the consequences of that theory being implemented in economic institutions, and then it materializes very concretely in an American or British corporation digging up the hills where they live. So I think also, if you don't believe in global justice or anything, purely epistemically, there's so much to learn from these views from the periphery because they see the effects of these things much more clearly. So I think I'll have to be very brief now. Yes, I'm at zero. I think political theory can contribute a lot to an alternative understanding where democratic control is embedded directly in the economy in order to bring it aligned with environmental and social sustainability, developing a better understanding of power, alternative economic institutions, and ideally, I'm still struggling with how to do this, but what I would love to see is the natural conditions of our existence always being integrated into theorizing. And then the choker question, how can we effectively communicate about these things with other groups, with society and other scientists? I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the comment.
Our commentators are coming forward now, and you can put up the signs that you won't be able to read unless your eyes are way better than mine, but never mind. Okay, first up is Sorin. I can't read my handwriting. Sorry.
It's okay, and it's difficult because it can be pronounced in so many ways. But it should be Sorin Baiasu, but it's usually pronounced Sorin Baiasu. So, but it doesn't matter really. Thank you. Jonathan thanked already the ECPR for organizing this event. Also thanked you. Let me start by thanking Lisa for a wonderful lecture. Lots to say here. It's very inspiring. I set my watch, however, to 5 minutes. So when the watch will pass me, I'm going to stop. I'm representing the Kantian Standing Group, ECPR Kantian Standing Group, full name Kantian Political Thought Standing Group. I'm going to focus on two things, both mentioned by Lisa. She mentioned about the wonderful tools that we have as political theorists, political philosophers. Let me mention a bit about the tools of the Kantian political philosopher. Of course, we draw on the tradition of famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. But if you look at contemporary philosophy, Kantian political philosophy and theory is quite dominant. It's not only about the egalitarian tradition of roles, but also the discourse ethics of Habermas. And then you get a variety of traditions. You have Kantian consequentialism, if you can believe it, and you have left Kantianism as well as libertarianism, kind of right Kantianism. You have Kantian perfectionism, as well as Kantian virtue ethics. So plenty to use. Let me now focus on another aspect mentioned by Lisa, which is the theory and applied part, abstraction and application. And I want in particular to talk about global and local issues. And about the significance of looking at local issues and their relevance for the global perspective. And I'm just going to mention one example. I am involved in research with the Stoke-on-Trent City Council. Keele University is based in Staffordshire. Stoke-on-Trent is the main city. I'm doing research with Stoke-on-Trent City Council. Of course, I approached them to learn, as Lisa mentioned about the deficit model. That was not the model I followed. I approached them to learn, and they want to introduce a new model, starting with their complaint services, but then wanting to kind of broaden this to other services, including children's services, social services, and they want to use restorative practices. Now, I have a project on Kantian justice, which is desert sensitive and also responsibility enhancing. I've been lucky to be awarded European Research Council advanced grant recently on this project. And I looked at their plans and we discussed. And one important issue for restorative practices is to realize that although they have been developed in response to desert theories, they realize more and more the importance of combining the two approaches. And one specific issue is the issue of second victimization. So what happens with the restorative practices is that you get together the wrongdoer and the wronged, and through a mediated discussion, you try to find a solution to restore relationships from before, and also to find the right way to move on. But the problem is that sometimes, if you're not careful enough, the victim, the wronged party, can be wronged a second time and can be convinced to adopt a solution which is in fact making him or her or them a second victim. So we work together. Thank you very much. We work together on this project with the suggestion of combining a desert approach and the restorative approach for the particular case of the complaint services to begin with. That's the pilot study. Now, restorative practices have been used in environmental studies, particularly for issues of loss, loss caused by environmental disasters. So this specific issue, of course, can be applied more generally to these global issues. My watch is telling me to stop. So thanks very much to Lisa once again. Thanks to you all. And I'll stop here.
Next up is Jonathan Floyd.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Jonathan Floyd, University of Bristol, and Standing Group Methods of Normative Political Theory. I won't say I represent that group unless what I say is very silly. Political theorists never say, I agree. They normally respond to everything with objections, or sometimes what we will have heard today, no doubt in many places, clarificatory questions, which are often not very clear and often not even questions. But there we go. I agree with Lisa. I agree that theorizing helps us understand that there is a crisis, what the crisis might mean, what the response to the crisis ought to be in terms of democratization, what democratization ought to mean, and indeed coming to the sort of critiquing of it, should it be put into play in practice. So I agree with all of that. I agree with the interdisciplinary of it, the open-mindedness of it, the working with citizens of it, but the theory of it. I recently ran a session for the new generation of fast-track civil servants in London about a month ago. Fast track, if you're wondering, means very self-confident. Bit of conceptual analysis there for you. No, they were very good. They were very open-minded. And we talked about essentially why theorize. The session was on the value of philosophical thinking in public life. And we talked about crises. I mean, the crisis most of you will be most familiar with was COVID. Right? There was a need even during COVID to theorize, to know whether people were dying with or from COVID, to know whether exercise included a 5-kilometer walk or a 50-kilometer bike ride, to know whether the latest details from the UK government were guidance or rules, because the police, for example, really needed to know that before they got their coercive arsenal out. And of course, for our Prime Minister, there's a big distinction between a party and a meeting. When does one become the other? Conceptual analysis matters, people. Theorizing matters from the top to the bottom. And if it matters, what I'm wondering, and this is my question for Lisa, if there's sometimes, you know, not just a place for it, but a duty to do it, and on whom that duty falls. Lisa talks about it a lot, about democracy in her work, and sort of presents us as, in Locke's term, a kind of democratic under-laborers, collaborators. But it's hard for lots of people to do it. Lots of people don't just say, why theorize during a climate crisis? They say, why should I theorize or even think about the climate when I'm living in a civil war, when I'm being bombed, when I'm poor, when I don't have a job, when I don't have a tenancy? That sort of maybe suggests that something falls on us as political theorists to do something, to think about something, to put some work in, because not everybody can, even if they think it ought to be done. That seems to push us towards a duty. On the other hand, I'm very conscious that so many of us lack tenure, lack secure tenancy, don't maybe have a place on the property market, live in countries where not just our job or our department, maybe even our whole university could get shut down if we say the wrong thing. That makes it hard to preach a duty. So this is what I'm wondering about. On the one hand, it seems like we have the kind of job in which we're interested in engaging with the public and talking about things like theorizing the climate crisis. On the other hand, you know, but is there a duty to do that? On whom does that duty fall? When does that duty fall? You know, even if we're being very mild and conversational in the way I think we should be when it comes to what I call public political philosophy, how do we talk about things like Gaza or genocide or gender, right, without being shot down, literally or metaphorically? So that's kind of my question to all of you to think about, but also to Lisa, because I agree theorizing in this way matters. I agree it matters during a crisis. I agree it can take the forms that she describes. I wonder if we sometimes want to go further and say sometimes there is a duty to do it, or on those that can, and if so, what form that might take. Thank you very much.
Andrei, Poama from the University of Leiden.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to join the others to thank Lisa for accepting the invitation on a relatively short notice, and for rejoicing us with a very intriguing and thought-provoking talk. I'm representing the standing group of political theory. For those of you in the room who are not members yet, please subscribe. I also want to thank the ECPR and also the four political thought, political theory, political philosophy. You choose the version that is closest to your heart, that co-organized this round table, so methods, international and Kantian, but also political theory. When I saw the title of the talk and got a bit of background into the talk and saw the slides, and in particular the title, "Why Theorize During a Climate Crisis," I thought not so much about the tools, and Lisa talked very incisively about the tools of political theory, but also about the tasks of political theory. And because, like many of us, probably I teach intro to political theory or intro to political philosophy, I go back to the contemporary grandfather of political philosophy. So I went back to Rawls, and he talks about the four tasks of political philosophy. So my invitation to Lisa in the Q&A, and maybe also to you, is to think about how those tools might be used in regard to what tasks of political theory. So I'd be interested to hear more from Lisa, from the discussants, from the room, about the tasks of political theory. Now, in the list of tasks that John Rawls gives, he talks about 4 tasks. I'm not going to run through all of them, but it seems to me that there are 2 on that list of 4 that seem particularly relevant in the context of a climate crisis. One is to identify grounds for agreement in the context of political conflict. That is to say, to divert the energy of both citizens and politicians from conflicts and take it in the direction of productive agreements. And the other one that seems relevant is in a very famous formula, to probe the limits of practical possibility. Now, Lisa talked about conceptual analysis, normative analysis, and history. But it seems to me that there is another thing that political philosophers do, or that we have done traditionally, which is imagining or reimagining politics. So I was wondering whether Lisa has something to say about that particular question. So in addition to explaining or interpreting or describing the political and social world, at which other disciplines from within political science might be better at doing, it seems to me that there is a distinctive task or kind of thing or kind of activity that political theorists tend to do, which is
imagining or reimagining practical possibilities. And that means institution building, that means policy making, and that means not just rethinking, but also thinking anew how a politics during the climate crisis might look like. So I'm very curious what Lisa thinks about that and what others in the room might think about that. Thanks.
Scherz from the University of Stockholm.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm representing here the standing group of international political theory. But I think we can all acknowledge that the theory groups have a certain overlap and that we often speak to each other about these different questions and with different methods, but that it all connects in certain ways. So what I want to do quite quickly is also say something about why we should theorize in a crisis, why I do think that that matters from our discipline, and then get into some questions about what I do think might be problematic in some of the suggestions and why I think we have to go even further than that, and then end with a question to Lisa quite quickly. So I do agree, and that's often the problem as we have figured out that we don't want to agree as theorists, and that if we agree, then we still find something to disagree about. But what I do agree about is that I find it extremely important to theorize in a crisis, first of all, because we have to define what kind of values we want to have as a society, and academia is a part of society, and that's one of the important things that I think we do. I saw this quite strangely and starkly in a conversation that I had with an advisor in Frankfurt from working for a bank. And I told him what I do for a living. And he said, yeah, but why is that important? You don't create anything of value. And I was like, what do you mean with value? What do you create of value? Well, I help certain groups make money. And I'm like, yeah, that kind of value. And so if we think that humanity has other values going beyond the financial, then I think we have to really have these conversations about what is valuable to us. And so the questions that we address often in theory about what we can know, what we can do, and what we should do, right? These are extremely important. And I think we can take a lesson from Iris Marion Young about how she defines politics as the thing that we can do something about together, right? Decisions that we can do something about together. And I think that really gets to the core about why we want to think about this as politics and as a discipline, why I think that it's actually very beautiful that theory and empirical science work together in political science. So one of the issues that I see often with what we're doing when we theorize is that we get lost in certain kinds of nitty-gritty theorizing, and that then what gets in the background are the big questions. And so I do think the call of really rethinking the boundaries that Lisa has put to us, and really also thinking more in terms of critical theory, sometimes looking at the injustice first and not first at a nice theoretical problem that we might be able to solve, I think that is extremely important. One problem that I do see with the call to work more interdisciplinarily is that we can see this as a call for individual action, but it's not as easy as that, right? It's not as easy as that because, again, as someone working on political questions, is we are working in an institutionalized setting, and we have certain institutionalized pressures. The pressure to publish and to publish in certain journals that are well received is one of them. And then often the high ranking journals are the ones that are in your specific domain and not the ones that publish interdisciplinary work. The second one is that often we are hiring people still very much in certain disciplines, and work that is interdisciplinary is not appreciated in these hirings. And then the last is also the way that we teach the disciplines. In my university, we have now created a lot of different MAs and BAs that are interdisciplinary BAs, but the way that we teach there is we get people from the different disciplines to teach the students that part of what we're doing in the disciplines, and we don't bridge what we're doing and just expect the students to understand how these things connect, even though we don't understand that ourselves. So the call here is really that, yes, we have to do this work much more, but that also means that we have to change certain structures that are ingrained in how universities are built and how we think about how we hire, how we publish. And so I think it's much more complicated, but the call is definitely there. And then I want to just end with one question to Lisa, because I thought the call to really overcome these questions about minds and bodies is very important. But I think it's not enough to just think that we don't have to put the mind over the body, and we also have to think about the bodies, but we also have to potentially overcome the distinction in general, right? It's not that we are thinking without our bodies. It's not that our bodies don't influence the way that we react to things, the way that we think about things, and how these two different things interconnect are potentially the things that we lose track of. And so my question is, don't we maybe have to even overcome this very stark distinction between the two? Thank you.
Thank you. So we now have at least one microphone to go back and forth between you guys, and microphones that go to you guys. And do you want to respond first?
I can say that. Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much. Let me just briefly react to a few things and to the questions that have explicitly been asked. So, Sorin, this sounds like a fascinating project. You're lucky to be in an English-speaking country. I'm in the Netherlands. I had to learn Dutch in order to be able to engage with local politics. And I'm saying this not because of myself, but because there is, I think, a tension in sort of the ideal of the hyper-flexible global citizens that we all are, sort of chatting from Japan to whatever, and being sufficiently locally rooted to do these kinds of projects. And because building trust with institutions, it takes a lot of time, and you need to build up networks, you need to find the right people, and you cannot do this if you're just sort of in one postdoc after another of 2 years each, spending lots of time on applications. So there is also a question about what we value in people's CVs. And I think I totally agree with the importance of the local engagement. And I would say you see the most abstract theoretical problems in these very concrete practices. And that's what your example exemplifies. Duty to theorize. I think there's something in sort of the deal that you accept if you become a theorist. About, okay, you take on a certain role that comes with lots of privileges. And of course, it's graded privileges. Some of us have more, others have less. And I think any kind of duty you could think of is also graded in that sense. I quite like the phrase speaking truth to power, in the sense that if you become a professor, I mean, the Latin is to profess, it's to say what you think. And I think there is something that gets overshadowed by all the careerism about the epistemic value of academia as just being the ones who try to stay oriented towards, well, truth is a big word. We don't maybe even dare to use this anymore, but at least sort of speaking out against falsehoods would often be a lot already. But I totally recognize the different vulnerabilities. And I guess for lots of people, it's also a question of finding forums. I mean, your example of speaking to civil servants is a very interesting one, and one that I imagine to have potentially a lot of leverage, because these people will go and be civil servants. Other people might find other forums, and it doesn't always have to be the big public, the big op-ed in the Guardian or whatever. It can be other spaces, and some of those spaces might also be more protected and thereby more accessible to people in more vulnerable positions. And in the end, you know, you might say, oh, I should do what has the most impact, and that's what lots of university administrators might want from you. But I think one interesting thing about theory is that you often cannot predict the impact. And I'll be brief, but there's this wonderful story of Mahatma Gandhi finding a copy of Ruskin's Unto This Last, which is sort of forgotten these days, but it was sort of a social egalitarian utopian booklet, little book. And Gandhi found this because someone had forgotten it on a train somewhere in South Africa. And it apparently influenced his thinking a lot. And sometimes when I hear all this stuff about university impact and you need to demonstrate it and so on, I think about that story in the sense of ideas find their own way to travel and you often cannot predict it. And so this orientation towards truth is also important because who knows in what ways ideas and arguments and texts concretely will have an impact later on. Roles and the reimagining of politics is one of the tasks. I'm sort of torn on this one, to be honest, because I sometimes wonder whether theorists are the best in the sense of having the right skills to really reimagine, and to what extent we should have a division of labor with artists like filmmakers and novelists. And the reason why I got to this position is that I once thought I would do a project on utopian novels written by social theorists of the past. And I started reading these utopian novels that people wrote, and they are also horrible ass novels. And so sometimes I wonder, yeah, okay, is it the best use of our time that we try to write those novels? Or should we try to sort of provide theoretical texts in the way that we are best, and then maybe inspire others, maybe collaborate with others? I don't know. But I would want to put something else into the reimagining space, which is sort of not just sort of visions that are theoretical. I guess many here will be familiar with the Realist Utopias project by Eric Olin Wright, and this idea that you try out alternative institutional solutions locally, and theorists go along and try to understand what works, what doesn't, evaluate, and which values are really being realized. And I think that's something that we should do much more if we could. And there, your point about universities and what they allow us to do or not comes in, because again, those are very time-consuming, long-term projects. You don't know whether you'll have an interesting outcome or not. And I think there's a lot that could and should happen at universities to open up more space for those kind of things, also in terms of what we value in publishing and so on. I'll not go into this because it's a big thing, but I mean, don't just go for the standard articles. It's just it's one medium, but it's really not the only one in which important ideas can be transported. And on the mind-body dichotomy, yes, I think you're right. And I think I want to hear more about what you mean exactly and how we can do this. So thanks for pushing me to go more radical here. Thank you.
Excellent. Please remember to introduce yourself very quickly.
Push up the slidey button.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Alex. I'm from Roskilde University, Denmark, postdoc there, doing research on collaborative governance. Initially, when you asked the question about whether I imagine myself as a theorist, I hesitated to answer both either an affirmative or negative, because the way I imagine it is similar to the fact that we all have to eat and live and breathe to live. I don't think myself as a breather or an eater. And I think with theory, and which maybe is considered across the board here, there's a similar agreement that it is inevitable in some degree, even if you don't explicitly theorize, at the very least, implicitly you adopt some assumptions. So I accept the premise of this whole roundtable discussion. Now I have two interlinked questions that you raised, Lisa, which I'd like to explore a little bit more and maybe hear what the panel members think, because I think you might have different opinions based on your philosophical backgrounds. The first thing is being self-referential about the point about value. What is the value of theory? Because when we think about value, I think one of the important things is that if something is valuable, it is first of all worth pursuing, and then, as theorists, worth analytically foregrounding. And whenever we do theorizing, I feel very often that there is no shared standards of value. And for that reason, there's also no shared standards for critique. So critiques often happen to be external critiques rather than immanent critiques, by which I mean that there are no shared standards, and that's why there's a lack of conversation. So my question is that a problem? Do we need to in order to be able to get progress in theorizing, can we meaningfully talk about making progress in theorizing? And the second question briefly is then returning to the point about, well, how or under which organizational context can we then best advance theorizing? You mentioned the deficit model, thinking about also collaborative models. Historically speaking, I think about this naive understanding of science in which we test different hypotheses and then there's some sort of survival of the fittest, but we know in reality there's a lot of power dynamics entangled in it. What are your opinions on the best organizational conditions under which theorizing can proliferate under inclusive conditions or whatever values you prefer? Thank you.
I can try, but you said you want to hear others, so someone needs to also then pick it up. Let me just give you one thought, and then I'll hand it to Sorin. So what are shared values and standards of theorizing? I'm not quite sure in what, I mean, there are different ways to understand the question, but one problem that I do see is that the field is sometimes the practices are fragmented into different traditions that seem to follow different logics, and a paper that might get totally, flying colors and get accepted immediately in one journal could be rejected, desk rejected by another one as that this is not acceptable. And there is a real question of how we deal with this. This is also sort of a question of how do you deal with different colleagues having different approaches. But I would say that there are certain epistemic values that you can still agree on, even if other substantial commitments might vary a lot. And those have to do with, are you clear enough to be understood? Do you want to be understood? Are the arguments sufficiently relevant? And also, do they cohere? Do they make, I think there's a way in which arguments can make sense that you can probably agree on from different angles. That's something my faculty is struggling with a lot because we have theoretical pluralism. It's a philosophy faculty, but there are lots of political philosophers. And on the good days, we do come together with the critical theorist and the anarchist and the meta-ethicist, agreeing on, okay, that was an interesting question. This was maybe a little bit sidetracking, and still having a meaningful conversation that furthers epistemic goals. And that's also one of the reasons why I think that the epistemic orientation mustn't fall away, because that should be what in the end brings all different traditions together.
Okay. So I think that question sort of exemplifies in some ways political theory at its best, but maybe sometimes publicly at its worst. The analysis, the critical analysis, the doubt, right? It's so useful. I can't have a conversation with anybody here outside of these settings without very quickly it shifting into the mode of counterexample, right? It's us at our best, and it's not that we're the only people who do it. We're not the only disagreeable, contrarian people in the world who doubt whether we have the right values. We're not the only awkward types, but we're so good at it. We train at it, and it has implications for how much time we spend in public life. We question so much our knowledge, whether we have access to speak truth to power, whether we can do this, whether we should be doing this, whether we have the right values. But what you have is a public realm dominated by other people, not just government and the think tanks and the journalists, but the economists, the historians, and so on. I look at public life, and even where we say the humanities or the social sciences are present, I don't see the philosophers. Even in the countries you associate with that, it's dying and dwindling. And it's in large part, or I think it's bound up with how critical we are, how self-critical we are, how habitually critical we are, how much doubt we have. We have to remember that the conversation is going to happen with or without us. I think that's really important to remember when it comes to those kinds of doubts, which, as I say, you express so well. But I think we need to remember the implications for that when we're not involved in the conversations about the big decisions.
Okay, thank you so much. Two great questions. So the first one on the value of theory and whether we can meaningfully make progress. My thought was that theory has so many values. I mean, there is, you sometimes create a theory and it might have very direct financial implications. So there is the economic value. There is the aesthetic value. Sometimes a theory is just beautiful. There are social values as well. Theories can bring us together or can organize us better. My kind of illustration and example was meant also to illustrate the fact that theory can be also very useful locally, but then that has echoes also at the more global general level. So I think there are many values that theory has. Now, you're right that there is a question about progress. How do we make progress? But it seems to me, again, going back to the local global, if we ask a general question about values or about progress, it's very difficult to find an answer. If we go to a specific question, a specific area, a specific issue, it's easier to focus on a particular value and to make progress as well. And concerning the best organizational conditions for theorizing, well, as you said, we are breathers. So we first need to have some basic conditions, where to live, what to eat. And we know that some of us don't have all of that. So we need that. And I guess then you can have more or less higher expectations. You know, how much money does your university have to pay for books and libraries and so on and so forth. Second condition, I think it's freedom. We cannot engage in theorizing without freedom and without accepting pluralism. So I would say these are the two conditions. But thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll be very brief. We're eaters, breathers. This reminded me. So in the ethics and in the politics as well, Aristotle draws a distinction between mere life and the good life. So the enumeration that you made of breathers, eaters, were also walkers and so on. I think you need theory in order to be able to attack the question of the good life, right? So, and that's the question of value. But the question can be asked in two ways, I think. So one is, what is the value of theory itself? And I think I was talking to Jonathan and others yesterday. I think we can talk about the existence value. So theory has a value in virtue of its own existence, like art and like nature. But also we can think about this in terms of the values that theorists share. And one way, and maybe that's even a project to think about, is to go into a seminar room or a roundtable like this and see and observe in a quasi-ethnographic way how theorists speak to each other and what kind of epithets and words they use. So arguments can be indeed beautiful, or theories can be beautiful, although beautiful theories can also be dangerous sometimes. But we talk about interesting arguments and an elegant objection. But if there is one set of values that I think we tend to share, there are logical and epistemic values. So we chase the inconsistencies and the contradictions, the non sequiturs and the fallacies. And I think on those values, typically, irrespective of tradition and orientation, style and approach, we tend to converge.
Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Simon Stevens from De Montfort University in the UK, and I'm thinking about what Jonathan said, that there's a duty to kind of do theory during a climate crisis. And I'm also thinking about impact, which was also mentioned. And I'm thirdly thinking about something Keele said over lunch, which I'm going to pretend is my idea now, which is that for a lot of us, actually, the biggest impact that we have is in the classroom with our students. And so, we try, I think, and remain impartial when we do this, go, oh, well, Nozick says this and Rawls says this, and why don't you decide? But I'm wondering in the context of, let's say, doing kind of climate theory, right, or disaster theory and stuff like that, are we supposed to remain impartial in that classroom?
I agree with the impact of teaching, and I've had a similar question very much on my mind recently a lot, which is the relation between being an academic and being an activist. And you can, of course, be an activist in the classroom in the sense that you push certain things. And I find it a really difficult question, and I'm not sure I can have a general answer, but I'll try to say what I think about the climate case. So I think in the case of something like the climate crisis, we can be non-neutral between climate change deniers and climate change acceptors or whatever, in the sense that we can say, look, here is what I base my judgment on, and I've come to the conclusion that anthropocentric climate change is real, and there is a real moral imperative to do something about it. That's the form of partiality, if you want to even call it that we need to take. But it's in this case very easy to say that because, you know, the scientific evidence has really come up so clearly, and there are many other areas where it's far more difficult. What I think is very important, that's also something where science communication has interesting things to say about, is that you need to be clear about your role. So sometimes it happens to me that students ask me something, and I say to them, look, this is one view that's being held in the literature, this is another one. I'm now going to tell you what my view is, and here are my arguments for it, but I'm not giving this to you as kind of the instructor in the sense of speaking for the field. So I think we need to make sometimes a distinction between, okay, this is a question on which we really have reasonable consensus, and, you know, always a few weirdos, but in general, people agree. And then we can present this as the view of the discipline. And other topics are such that we can only give them our own judgments that we have arrived at. But we need to be very clear about which is which, I think, because that's a matter of respecting also their autonomy and not sort of overstepping the boundaries of our role. But in that sense, I often do that, and not because I'm pushing for it, but because the students ask me all these questions, and they sometimes it makes me, I mean, this is mostly teaching in PPE context. The students have so many critical questions about our economic system, and they want not only a presentation of what the field thinks, but they also want that one person who happens to stand in front of them to give them something. And they may disagree, but they at least want to hear it. And in a way, if I reveal it, they understand better where my other judgments might come from. So I think it's probably better than trying to pretend that you can actually be neutral on many of these things. So that's how I'm trying to deal with this. There's the bigger question. So in the Netherlands, there have been lots of protests recently where professors went in their academic gown on the streets and blocked a motorway, and there was a lot of discussion. Is it legitimate to use your academic outfit for that kind of protest? So that's related in a way. But the problem there is, of course, that you cannot have this nuanced discussion. The nice thing about a seminar room is that you can actually say, I'm now saying this from that role, and here's something else that I'm, so I think the classroom is actually a very good space for having these kinds of discussions without a problematic imperative of neutrality.
Sure. So for me, when I try to teach, and I also teach in some interdisciplinary courses, and I think there the question often comes up, but what do you think? What's the right normative take on this? And I often teach actually a textbook that takes very clear and extremely left-wing positions on these takes. And so a lot of students have come up to me and have said, like, but what if I don't share this left-wing view? And my answer has always been, it doesn't matter whether you share the view or not. What matters is, can you argue for the one side or the other? So what I'm trying to teach, and I think that's often a way to address whether we have to be neutral or not, is not so much actual positions, but a way to think about the different positions, the way to argue for them, and to simply think critically about certain things. Because often, right, students also answer to some of the things that I say, yeah, but it's not like that. And I'm like, yes, but how should it be? Right. And so just to raise these questions, to give them methods to inquire into the different positions, I think that's the value of theory, and that's what students can take away from that, and less a stance on either a topic or on a particular theory.
Also, two questions, three, four. One was here, and one was someone there in the middle. That was you. Okay, and the next set is you and you. You go first, please.
Right. So
Take two questions together so that
So I'm 10. I work for the University of Stirling. I work a bit on statues and monuments, and I also work a tiny bit on climate activism. So my question follows a bit from the previous one. So why are we theorizing when probably given the threat of the climate crisis, we should probably be a bit more acting, you know, when we theorize on, oh, activists shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that, shouldn't be violent, shouldn't harm people. Why not just try to say we should support all out climate activism to, you know, so that we won't all die by the heat or the cold or whatever.
Hi. Oh God, that's quite loud. I'm Matthew. I'm from CEU in Vienna. And just a quick question for Lisa on the dialogue between Western and other traditions, because I'm quite interested in that, and I'm a theorist as well. And my question really is, how do you do that really in a mature and respectful way that doesn't end or risk collapsing into sort of some sort of intellectual cannibalism, where you include more and more thinkers from outside the Western tradition, but you're kind of just stealing inverted commas, their ideas and bringing them into your discourse, and where do we draw the line between, am I allowed to take your ideas from, external texts versus, maybe I should get someone from this tradition to come and speak directly to me? And maybe you can say more about your collaboration as a perhaps a technique, if you think, around that.
I'll say something about that question. I think so. I suppose it touches on the other issue about why not just. I mean, I think any kind of activism there's still a dialogue. You always need a dialogue. You always need to know exactly what you're aiming for, why, being able to defend it. Right? There's lots of people involved. Completely lost my train of thought with your question now. That's a theoretical vice, isn't it? No, I guess my point is this. So it could be cannibalism, but it assumes that it's always just one person. So for example, when I talk about public political philosophy, I don't imagine one person becoming an all-powerful guru. That's what we too often think about when it comes to being a public intellectual. We think of being a Sartre, or maybe even today someone like a Michael Sandel, or even, Elizabeth Anderson or someone, or, what you really need is hundreds and thousands of people. Right, and then the cannibalism worry goes away. Like the problem with your objection is it sort of assumes there's one person and they're devouring everything up like a sort of philosophical Pac-Man, right? But actually, it could be a team, right? And there could be lots of people. And as soon as there's lots of people, you can have diversity across that group of people. You can have lots of opinions across. You can have lots of forms of expertise across that group of people. So I think it's really important we remember that. Don't just think that everything we're calling for or suggesting is something that's all done by one person who is all powerful and all listened to, right? It takes hundreds and thousands.
Yeah, just to add, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here because these questions have been plagued scientists working with indigenous groups for at least a few decades now. And I mean, there are lots of case studies of how it can go wrong and along the lines you mentioned. A few of the things that have become very clear if you read around about these scientists' local collaborations is a matter of long-term relationships that you need to build up. It's also a matter of recognition. So concretely, authorship is often an issue. Who gets the authorship? When it comes to something like patents, for example, herbal medicines or so, you also have very clear financial questions. I'm not sure this would come up with theorists, but who knows? So I think there are already some things that academia has learned by having done it wrong and where you can build on, what's a better way of doing it. The biggest obstacle, I think, is very often the time investment and how you build these kind of long-term relationships. In the collaboration with Flavia, I was very lucky I could get her over and we were really working together. We know each other from an online network and we've been interacting for years already online. And then at some point I was like, look, I have a bit of money. Can we actually work together? And she has invited me back. I haven't gone yet. I hope I can at some point. But it's often... It's the personal connections also really matter. And that's an investment. And often beforehand, you don't know whether something will come out of it. So it's a risk, but I'm privileged enough that I wanted to take it. And I hope it's so rewarding. So in that sense, it doesn't feel like I'm doing something right here. It's really, I'm benefiting a lot. So And on the other question, should we be more activists? I mean, there's a differentiation I would make between should we all be more activists as citizens or as theorists? Because maybe as citizens, we should all do more, but that's not only on us, that's on everyone. And should we be more activist as theorists? I think a good way of asking the question is, what is it that we can specifically contribute as theorists? And maybe some people like to be out on the street. I have great admiration for them. I think that that's needed. It's not my way of contributing. I'm maybe better at, I don't know, talking to a group of economic leaders and showing, well, even that woman who looks like she's a serious person, not an activist, she also has these positions. So I'm trying to play that kind of role. And I often feel I should do more. So in that sense, I agree with you. But the question then is really, what are the ways in which we can really make a specific difference? Sometimes we can maybe also contribute by donating if we have a decent income, and then really think about what are the networks I have, what are my skills, what are my capacities. And one last note here is, I mean, you see a lot of activist burnout because people who are really into it, often they are very active for a short time, and then at some time they get very exhausted because they don't see progress. And I would say, try to make it a long-term game in the sense that you find your ways of being active that allow you to do it over years and not just months.
Okay, the next set of two questions, a gentleman over there and then there.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question builds a little bit on one of the previous questions, which is a bit contrarian as well. Do we have time for theorizing when we know that, you know, anthrax might come out of the Siberian tundra in a couple of years? Do we have time for theorizing, and should we keep theorizing if/when theory never translates into practice?
I'm Tobias Arnoldersen. I'm a legal theorist, actually, from Tilburg University. And as an apology, perhaps, to my colleague, my question will be very theoretical again. I have a question for Lisa, because you allude at the same time to overcoming the boundary between the body and the mind and emotion and ratio. Yet at the same time, you want to hold on to the notion of speaking truth to power. And you did it hesitantly, but in the end, you are loath, I think, to lose the issue of truth. But truth is a rather rationalistic category, wouldn't you agree? An emotion is, in a sense, beyond truth and falsehood. It's felt, it's immediate. It doesn't care whether it's true or not. But when you put it in the sphere of truth, you start to investigate the emotion, and then you'll use ratio again. So to what extent can you really be committed to, or do you have to stay committed to rationalism when you are a political theorist?
Could I start with the answer to the first question? I think we theorize all the time. I mean, I don't think we can get rid of doing that. I mean, there is very basic theory that we do every moment when we make a decision, because what we do is we need to abstract from all the things that we get from the environment, focus on certain things, do some very basic connections between thoughts, and then make a decision. Now, even when there isn't much time to do something, we still need best theories possible to respond to the crisis. You still need a solution to the anthrax threat. So you still need theories. So I would think that whether we want it or not, we do need to theorize to respond best to those situations where we don't have time, precisely. Now, of course, it's going to be a matter of prioritizing, and of course, it's going to be a matter of which theory we are going to, or which area we are going to focus on. But I don't think we have a choice. We do need to theorize. Thanks.
Thanks for the second question. I'll respond to that one. And I guess I agree with a certain reading of your question, namely that we need to remain committed to certain epistemic values. But I'm not sure I mean, this is a kind of worms we're opening up here, but I don't think that the way in which I think about the role of emotions and the role of the body is really forcing me to give up these epistemic values in any way. I know that there's a certain way of understanding, oh, emotions, we need to acknowledge all emotions equally, and we need to somehow, you end up becoming relativist, basically. And I don't want to become relativist. And not only because I think that's epistemically harmful, but also because if you're committed to the idea of democracy, you need to be committed to the idea that there is a common realm that we are all talking about together to govern it together. If you have complete relativism, everyone in their own bubble with their own emotions, there cannot be a shared public space that makes the idea of democracy meaningful. So I am committed in that way, but I think that this space can be more open than it has often been imagined in the past. And I mean, you said rationalist, and that's where I'm getting my doubts, because it depends a bit on how exactly you flesh that out. But I think that space can also allow for an acknowledgement of our embodied nature much more than it has in the past. And as I briefly mentioned, I mean, if there's a whole medical dimension, and sometimes I think we could really benefit from more interaction between the normative analysis of institutions and attention to the body in that sense, because they would give us so much, potential arguments for the political impact. I mean, if you think about something like the deaths of despair, that certain people, certain demographic groups in the US are dying prematurely, in my reading, I would say because of issues of economic justice. But the economic justice discourse doesn't connect to the medical discourse, and thereby gives up on an important argument that could be made in public discourse to convince more people and politicians and so on that something needs to change. So I don't think there's anything relativistic about that way of taking the body into account.
I think I'll dodge the rationalism rabbit hole, but address the anthrax, given its urgency. I mean, my question, to you in response would be, what are you going to do if not theorize, right? What is your particular, or this apply? I'll ask this of myself. What am I going to do if not theorize about that, right? What, given my skill set, given my means, right? I could run, yeah. I could try not to breathe, but we've established we're all bodies who breathe, right? So that's that, right? I think that the problem we often make in some of these conversations is we're equating the question, what should I do, with what the world should do, or what the world should prioritize, right? The question, what should I prioritize given my skill set and means, is not the same as what Just Stop Oil should prioritize as a body of activists, or what the defense industry or the defense bodies should prioritize, right? There's a sort of unintentional egotism to it, that we should be prioritizing what everybody else prioritizes. What we prioritize is based on what we can do, what we're trained to do, given our humble means, in the hope, speaking of rationalism, that, we've got something like the truth and that something like power is listening, right?
Just also very briefly in reaction to the first question. So the history of political thought and political philosophy and political theory is actually full of concepts. There's another thing that we do which is concept construction or concept creation, besides concept analysis, that are actually associated with, in the sense of having prompted new or inspired new practices, or having clarified practices that already existed in a way that improved them. So we can draw a very long list, but we all have it in our Intro to Political Theory or Intro to Political Philosophy, Intro to Political Thought syllabi, social contract, basic income, the difference principle, the tragedy of the commons. Those are big concepts that theorists, historians of political thought, rediscover, theorists and philosophers construct, that actually generate new practices. The separation of powers would be another one. So the history of political thought and political theory is full of concepts that are practice heavy and practice inspiring, I would say.
Okay, then I'll take the next round of questions. You and then you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hanna-Kaisa Hoppania. I'm from the University of Galway. My question speaks to, I guess, to the question of what can we contribute as theorists in the context of climate crisis. So if I want to explain to a lay person what is theory or what's the value of theory, I would say something like, theory makes you or helps you to see something that you didn't see before, or it helps you to see things in a new way. And maybe you see something you didn't see before and now you can't unsee it. So in that kind of a way, and I think it was Iris Marion Young who said philosophy is about finding the place to state the obvious or something like that. So, you know, seeing something suddenly clicks and makes sense and you see something. Okay, so what is the, if you think about this in relation to the climate crisis, what can we do as theorists? You know, what can we help people see? So it's not the facts, it's not the kind of natural science stuff, you know. So I think it's about relationships and relations. And I'd like to hear a little bit from the panel about relationality, because this is hasn't come up really yet. You talk about boundaries and categories, but you know, politics is about power relations and relationality between different groups of people, or between the economy, or economy and politics, or whatever way you want to see relationality. I'd like to hear something on that.
Yeah, okay, hello, my name is Martin Neumann from University of Southern Denmark, and I would like to pick up this question on rationality, or yeah, how humans perceive the world. From 2 points. First of all, I have a certain background in complexity theory, and complexity theory has developed some concepts such as tipping points or points of no return. So certain ways of perceiving the world, which so to say allows you to way to see the world in a certain way. And the other background is that in the philosophy of ecology, there's this notion of Umwelt developed by Keele. I'm wondering, so my question is, and so theorizing is one way of how humans are, of one element of the human Umwelt, so to say, in Keele's sense. And I mean, the biomass of ants is still much bigger than the biomass of humans in the world, but nevertheless, the ecological fingerprint of humans seem to be much more significant than that of ants. But maybe since the first humanids came from Africa to Europe with, from our perspective, perhaps very simple boats, but from the ecological perspective, highly developed technology, humans can be seen as a kind of invasive species which goes in the Arctic region and invaded even the space and the moon. So it is very rapidly spreading all over. And also, as all this notion of the Anthropocene, or the extinction of species, or the Capitalocene, shows that there's a certain growth success, so to say, that human species can outcompete other species, which can be seen as a confirmation of this kind of the success of the way in which the human Umwelt is constructed. And so, but I'm wondering if and how, from the perspective of human theorizing, it is possible to set, so to say, tipping points or points of no return from the perspective of theorizing in the domain of the human Umwelt, so to say.
Questions, or would you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure if this is a question or not. So I'm Caroline Kazemko. I'm from the University of Warwick. I am not a political theorist at all, but I work on the politics of climate change, hence I was drawn here today. And so with this question of should we theorize or should we act, I think that, you know, do whatever comes first, you theorize, but then always try and think about who to communicate it to and when you can communicate it to someone in whatever space. I mean, it could just be an individual, it could be in the pub, it could be, I'm thinking now of Simon Caney, who's done a lot of work with the UNFCCC. He has helped them to think through how to politicize some of the science by thinking about intergenerational justice, and then how to, that could underpin some of the moves that, how to frame climate change as a political problem. So there's always the possibility to communicate to someone somewhere at some level. And then on to the question of duty as teachers. So I do a lot of teaching of the politics of climate change. And I just think of my classroom, like particularly the undergraduates, as groups of people who mainly won't be coming back into the university system, but will be going out into a tricky real world. Many of them may have jobs where they are specifically supposed to be meeting net zero targets or enacting climate mitigation policies to meet targets in all sorts of types of jobs. And this question of what political theory does is so important because it helps them to identify what the conflicts are and what the ideas or the assumptions are that underpin those conflicts, like around values, what we value and how we value it. So it's this idea of revealing what is assumed and using that to then identify, well, why is there conflict here and what could we do about it? How could we identify the grounds of agreement to bring that together? So for me, that's like the real value of theory and teaching it.
You guys.
That's right. Okay. I'll start with a quick thought, kind of reflective thought on theory, and hoping to get to all three questions in this way. So far we mentioned about the important role that in political theory, the important role that critical perspective has. But it seems to me what is equally important is that you have theory also to provide an agreement that is justified. So you don't always need to respond by criticizing or by formulating an objection. You can also agree because you think that what was said for the good reasons. But you cannot say that what was said for the good reasons unless you are able to theorize, unless you are able to think of the justification and of the reasons. And it seems to me that contributes a lot to relations, because of course, forming relations, developing relations, in general relationality, cannot survive just by a critical attitude. You need also this agreement that is so important. Secondly, concerning the rationalism, well, I mean, here is a bit of a joke, but why don't you all become a Kantian?
It had to come out in the end, didn't it?
I mean, he is famous for having said that he, reconciled the rationalist and empiricist tradition. So please join the Kantian. But again, perhaps leaving joke aside, it is an important question. It seems to me what happens is the following. It's not perhaps so much rationalism, but it's modernity. In modernity, we always seek something new, and we always think of expanding. But theory should help us precisely to try to see perhaps the value of what we already have, rather than trying to find something new, occupying new spaces, going even further. The theory should help us to find a different way, and I think it's quite essential in this sense. And concerning the duty as teachers, I absolutely agree. I mean, all these are great questions. One thing I wanted to say just very quickly, I think theory helps us also to discover power relations. And this is so important in the relation between teachers and students, but we need theory for that. Thank you.
I just want to say a very warm welcome to the non-theorist in the room from Warwick. I'll be telling the ECPR you were here and that there was 100 of you. Just to echo what Sorin was saying, and so I'll also say again to you, as I said to Lisa, I agree, right? I agree. If the climate is burning, we need to understand why. It's going to be in large part because of the rules and institutions in the world, right? The rules of the states, the markets, etc., how they work. What they are is expressions of principles and ideas. Theorists can help understand those markets, those systems of property ownership, those principles at play in the world that decide who gets what and who decides who gets what. So that's a welcome and an agreement.
Yeah, I think that there's also a line that runs through the three questions that has to do with value rationality. And I mean, I'm thinking of it roughly along the Weberian lines of means ends instrumental rationality, and the way in which the human species has developed. I mean, what you described about being ultimately more powerful than the ants, that has a lot to do with instrumental rationality and being able to pursue our goals very effectively. But one of the things that theorists do is point out that there are other forms of value, and even the very act of theorizing expresses not only an instrumental rationality. It can, there can be goals, we can pursue them through theory, but there is also the value of theorizing, which is a different kind of value. And I think sometimes I have students who tell me, oh, it's all lost. We're all part of that system. It's, capitalism is eating us all. And then sometimes when I'm a little bit tired of making other arguments, I'm saying, but look, we're still here, still theorizing. The system's still allowing that to happen. Isn't that at least, a little bit of hope? So I think and that's also something that students can get from theory, I think, to at least become aware that there is something that is not instrumental rationality, that's something else. And speaking about relationality and relationships, I mean, many of these values can only be realized in relationships. And I mean, again, at the risk of sounding a bit non-rationalistic, but it's also, I think, relations with non-human animals, relations with nature, where we experience certain values and maybe we didn't have the best concepts yet. I should, sorry. But I think that's one of the ways in which we can then also sort of maybe a little bit inspire students by trying to have relations with them that try to express values other than the purely instrumental ones. And I'm not saying that teachers in other fields can't do this as well. I think that, but I think that's also something that students experience as valuable about theory classes, that it's really about the arguments being taken wherever they go and really taking this the thought process seriously. And I think that can be an experience that's maybe they will not remember the details of the arguments, but they will remember what it was like to engage in thinking. And that would be one of the best things I could imagine someone say about a class.
Yeah, so I think I want to take up the question about acting and theorizing very quickly, because again, I think just holding these two things completely separate as such is a mistake, right? We need theory to act, right? Otherwise we just run around planlessly. So there's the rationality aspect of that, but we are also already acting while we're theorizing. So we don't sit alone in a room and read the book, and then that's the end of the story, right? We talk to others, we exchange ideas, we try to understand things better together. And so in that sense, I don't think they are completely separate, but we're already acting in the way that we think about things and in the way that we might think differently about things. And so I do think this already brings in the question about relationality in a lot of ways, right? So these interactions are so important, and we can really understand these ways in which we relate to each other much better through these ways of thinking. But I do think there is, in fact, an issue in a way that theory has for a long time not thought about relationships in very helpful ways, right? So when we think about power, a lot of people really just think that one person has more and the other person has less. So we think about piles of goods. We don't think about the relations between these people, and we often don't think about the environment of institutions and ways that other people outside those two have to act to actually uphold those power relationships. So a lot of people might recognize Young in what I'm saying here. But so I think that's one way in which we often have neglected relationality, and another way in which we have often neglected relationality comes from feminist theory very much, right? So we often have imagined individuals as these abstract, rational beings that don't have any needs. So we're all just producing things and we're independent and we're all doing that, right? And we're neglecting that we're actually, we need care, we need to be caregivers, we need to have these ways in which we actually uphold the society. Otherwise, right, nothing ever gets done. And so I think bringing in these questions about relationalities is extremely important and essential to think about politics in general.
So very briefly, because I think we all need coffee. On the question of students and power, and I would combine the question about students to the question about power. I teach in a government public administration department. So my audience, the people to whom I speak, the students that I have in front of me, are basically future civil servants or people who are going to work for consultancies that do the work that civil servants are supposed to be doing. So in that sense, I see my job as a political theorist or as a political philosopher in the Intro to Political Philosophy course, not just about speaking truth to power, but also about educating those who are going to be in power, in the sense of making them curious and making them critical. And there's one question that I tend to ask, and I ask it twice in the Intro to Political Philosophy course. Once at the very beginning of the course and then towards the end. And so the question is, by whom would you rather be governed? By people who have taken one political philosophy class or by people who didn't? And at the beginning, they just look relatively blankly at me and they shrug and they don't really care about the question. But their gaze and reactions are way more enthusiastic and way more convinced towards the end. So for those who doubt about the value of political theory and political philosophy, if you would rather be governed by people who have taken one political theory class, then political theory, I think, has value.
Thank you, everyone.